Well, good afternoon, everybody. What a beautiful day here in Wethersfield. I'm Joshua Torrance, the Executive Director here at the Webb-Deane-Stevens Museum, and I'm so excited to be here with you today on Juneteenth and to bring this fascinating story that John has worked so hard on to this audience and to the broader public in general. Today, John Mills traces his own path in discovering his personal ties to slavery, what it taught him about himself, and the challenges he would eventually face while attempting to find the burial locations of his ancestors. In his lecture, John will marry his experiences and revelations to that of Connecticut's Prince Mortimer. As he brings to light the largely untold story of Prince Mortimer, John evaluates the ripple effects of a past time. Originally from San Diego, John is a technologist by trade, but a genealogist and equity advocate by passion. Oops. Cindy, nope, I don't need you. Do I need you? I think I need you. There we go. The descendant of both southern and northern slaves, as well as the descendant of slave holders due to their relationship with female slaves, John focuses on unearthing little-known people and stories of this country's history in slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. John's goal is to honor the forgotten, as well as to apply critical thinking to our history and to find solutions to the many ripple effects today. So it's my great pleasure to welcome John to the podium.
Wow, Joshua says that in a way that sounds so fascinating. I almost sat down. Thank you all for coming. It's Father's Day on Juneteenth. And I came out here to listen to this. It's a fascinating story to me, but I was telling a few folks that the fact that it's interesting and fascinating to anyone else is humbling that you would come here to listen. So
it better be good.
Okay. After what Joshua said, good. Okay, so and I'm gonna try to like stay on message and stay on point because it's actually more of like a 2-hour lecture that I'm gonna condense a little. And so and I'll probably be my wife's here. I'll have to look at. She's probably going to give me the evil eye when I start rambling right now. So I'll try to stay on message. I'm going to start with myself, so you kind of know who I am and kind of know what my history is. And my name is John Mills. As Joshua said, I was born and raised in San Diego, California. I moved my family all the way out here to the East Coast back in 1998 following my job. I identify though more as a husband, father, grandfather. I know a lot of folks that you ask them who they are and they immediately talk about their job or their, for me, I've always been very inspired by my grandparents, who were heroes to me and taught me a lot. So, and I tried to kind of walk in their message with my daughter and my kids. So that for me just kind of identifies me better. So I just say I'm a husband, father, and grandfather. Relative to my story, growing up in the 70s, my father was very deliberate about ensuring that I knew my value. So, and I didn't quite get why he was so deliberate. He just looked really aggressive. But he was very deliberate about it. And I mean, I understand of the time, as I was being born, Martin Luther King Jr. had just been shot. Malcolm X just prior to that, 7 years before that. Medgar Evers. Muhammad Ali at the time was fighting going to Vietnam. I mean, so there was just a lot going on. And so he recognized that there may be challenges for me. And so he was just very adamant to like speak against what he saw as what society may have been trying to tell me. So he was really clear about your skin is beautiful, your hair is not nappy, it's strong. And he was just really adamant about that. And the messages, I didn't quite understand them, I guess is the best way to describe it. When I got a little older, it was really clear to me that, well, it wasn't clear to me. As an adult, it was clear to me that I had an unconscious bias against my own skin color, right? Like it wasn't something that I was processing. It wasn't something that I was consciously thinking about, but I did. It took years into adulthood before I recognized that I always had that. And when I recognized it, it was once my daughter was born. And I was trying to teach her similar messages as my father, and I started interrogating that, and then looking back to my life experiences and seeing instances where there was bias, and I just didn't translate it because my mindset was that I deserved that. Like I didn't realize it until my daughter was born. So once I recognized it, I started trying to affect not only how I raised my daughter, but the outside world. I had this epiphany that I could affect the outside world. And I thought, well, I must have come to that conclusion because it wasn't in my household. I must have come to that conclusion because what I was seeing in media and what I was seeing in the world. So why don't I just represent myself to the world in a way that changes the world's perspective, right? As if I could like boil the ocean. And so at the time I was traveling for work, and I was constantly very amenable, trying deliberately to be as least threatening as possible to anyone, right? I was in Ohio. I was traveling with 3 women, 3 white women, and they were from different areas of the country. We would all collect in certain areas of the country once a month as part of our work. And at the time, the O.J. Simpson trial was going on, and I'd been using this strategy for years, right? And we're in the lunchroom in Ohio, and there's Simpson trial on the television, and one of these women asked me, John, so you think he did it? And my mind was in that appease, amenable, show different perspective, sort of show a different vision of what they expect kind of mindset. And I hadn't really been following the trial, but I thought what they wanted to hear was what I said. So I said, yeah, I don't know, he probably did it. And the response back to me was, yeah, John, see, that's why we like you. You're different. And when I heard that, it blew up my whole strategy. I'm like, I've been acting like this all this time. And now I'm just an outlier, right? It didn't work. So I was somewhat lost at that point. So I just doubled down on my dad's strategy, which was very deliberate with my daughter. Like, you're beautiful. This is, don't do this, don't go here. And if you hear this, that they're the ones with the problem, not you. It was just very deliberate, thinking that more of a defensive strategy, thinking that I can't affect the outside world. It's just, I gotta be, we're hunkering in. And it stayed that way until around 2002, when my sister and I had both moved to the East Coast. We were both from San Diego. We both moved out here. She was married to a man who was in the Navy. She moves to Virginia. I'm here in Connecticut. we're both kind of homesick. Both of our my father's parents had recently passed, and she starts into genealogy research. And she uncovers things that I was baffled by. But before I get into that, I'll kind of tell you what I knew before she starts teaching me this information. What I knew about my genealogy was my mother was a child of an immigrant from some country. Like her mother was from some country, but I didn't know what country. And I knew my mom's father was from Baltimore. I knew my father's parents were from Texas. My father's very fair skinned. For whatever reason, I thought he had like Native American in his family. I never thought it was anything other than that, right? And I guess I assumed, I put that at the last bullet, I guess I assumed my ancestors were slaves, but I never really gave it a whole lot of thought. I wasn't sure. And if they were, I just didn't know to what extent. I had no clue. So my sister starts doing this research, and she would send me information as she uncovers things. And so the first thing she uncovers, on the left, that's my grandfather, Mylan Mills, and I knew him extremely well. He never talked about his past. I never knew him to have any siblings. I never knew how he got to San Diego. I knew nothing. And she discovered that his parents were Robert and Eliza Mills from East Texas. And once she found them, she also found Robert's father in a 1880 census. His name was Ned. And we could find him back to 1870, but if you went any further back, you find him nowhere. And I'm asking her, what does that mean? And she's like, probably slaves in Texas, East Texas. Like, that's why we're not finding anywhere beyond that. And I was like, wow, this is crazy. She then shows me a picture that she discovered of my grandfather's mother. And that's what you see on the lower right. Along with the picture, she purchased at the time, I don't know that you have to do that now, through Ancestry, I think you can just pull the stuff up. But at the time, she purchased the death certificate. And there was some amazing stuff on this death certificate. One, it said she died in 1918 of the Spanish flu influenza. And I was going, I know that, that was the pandemic, right? And so I was all shocked. I'm like, wait a minute, your mom's tied to the flu pandemic. And then she says, I think we know where she's at too. It says on here, she's born at she was buried at Hickory Grove Cemetery. And I was like, we gotta go there then. We gotta go, this is crazy. We gotta go to Texas so that we can go see where she's buried. So we plan a trip. We go to Henderson, and we're assuming at the time that it's more than just my grandfather's mother that's there. We're assuming we're going to find all kinds of people, and we're going to use the cemetery as a means for getting additional documentation, right? So we get to the cemetery, and the cemetery is beautiful. It's well kept, and it's nice fence around it, and all the stones look like they're just being cleaned every day or something. We're like, this is amazing. So we start walking through the cemetery, and we quickly realize we didn't have any family members in that cemetery, so we're lost now. And my sister sees a lightly worn path along the outside of the fence. And so we decided to walk that path, which led us into the woods behind the cemetery. And that's where we then started to find names of ancestors we knew. That picture on the left is what it looked like when we got there in 2004. And so we were just stunned. They were down, it was very bright and light at the cemetery front, the whites only cemetery, but in these woods, because everything was so overgrown, it was just darkness. It was just dark in there. We never found Eliza, although we knew she was there because we had the death certificate. And we knew our family was there because we found others. But we left there extremely disappointed, a little saddened, envisioning our family walking that same track and looking at this beautiful cemetery to walk into the woods. We left there, that was just burned into my brain. This year we went back. We went back because a couple years ago, a retired police officer told us that he found their graves. Actually, it was 6 years ago. He told us he found their graves. So we went back because we wanted to see. He sent us pictures of the markers, but it took us too long to go back. So when we went back this year, all the winters and all the leaf fall and now those markers are covered again. So we have a crew going back this fall with rakes and tools to try to find these markers that this retired police officer found for us. So that's my father's father. She also did a lot of research into my father's mother. And I knew her extremely well as well. She died the year I moved here to Connecticut. She's one of, I was very close with her. And I also knew her mother. And her mother died when I was a teen. And her name was Tony. And I also knew that her maiden name was Kyle. But that is about all I knew about my great-grandmother, Tony. She died in 1984. But my sister discovered her parents. And when she discovered her parents, she found some fascinating information out about each of them. My great-grandmother's mother, her name was Mary White. She was the product of a relationship that an Irishman had. He was a married Irishman who purchased her mother specifically for the sexual relationship. And she was the product of that relationship. And so my sister had that information as well as the name of her mother, which was Marguerite, and she was brought here from Africa. And that stunned me. Like, I had never even heard stories like that before at the time, that slaveholders had slaves that they used in that capacity. Like, that was news for me. And then I learned about my great-grandmother's father. His name was John Kyle. He was also a slave. Everyone highlighted in yellow there was a slave. He was also a slave. His parents were Sam Kyle and Vinnie Kyle, or the maiden name was Newman. And Sam was an overseer on the Kyle property in Texas. They were all owned by the Claiborne Kyle family. Claiborne Kyle was relatively well known in Texas at the time. He had been a senator in Mississippi, and he had been a senator in Texas. And he had 5 sons, all of whom fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy, and one of which also became a politician in Texas. And the town that they lived in was called Kyle, Texas. It was named after them, right? And that was fascinating to me. So we took my father wanted to see a lot of this, so we went back to Texas again earlier this year. So we went to see some of this as well. So we went to Kyle, Texas, and we met some of Claiborne Kyle's ancestors. We found while we were there that Texas A&M, their stadium is Kyle Field. It's all kind of named after Claiborne Kyle and his descendants. And so it was just a fascinating kind of experience and journey to kind of learn these things. This picture is a picture of the 8th Texas Cavalry that all of Claiborne Kyle's children were a part of, his 5 sons. And so where I'm going with this is, one part of it was, I was learning that I had some DNA relationship to the Kyle family because their affiliation with my family. There was an Irishman on on the other side of my father's DNA, where it was related to an Irishman who purchased someone, and it all of a sudden clicked in my mind. Well, I guess that's why his skin was always fair, and that's why his mother's skin was fair, and that's why his mother's skin was fair. Like I spent all my life just assuming it wasn't that, but that's what I discovered. We went to the Kyle family cemetery, and similar to what I found with my father's father, my father's mother her family being owned by Kyle's, same thing. We went there and I found Claiborne Kyle's plot, but you see a tree line behind me. My ancestors are beyond that tree line. We ended up walking beyond that tree line, and we were able to find one of my family members. But most of them, the stones were broken, worn away, or so cheaply positioned that they would have weathered by now. So we really didn't get any information from that cemetery that we could kind of use as a part of our continued journey. So that's 2 of my grandparents. That's my father's parents. My sister started then doing research into my mother's parents, and she started with my mother's father. His name was John Smith, and I knew him well as well. He died in 2007. He was a military man, hard and fast, Navy man. And all my life, whenever I walked in the room, he saluted. 3 years old, he's saluting me. Right? All my life, he did the same thing. And my sister discovered his parents' names, his parents' names, but most fascinating that I found with regards to his family was his great-grandfather. His great-grandfather's name was William Cooper. And what we discovered is William Cooper was also in the Navy. And I don't think my grandfather ever knew that. He died, I don't think he ever knew that. We discovered that he never told us anything about that. He talked to me about his family, but it was always specifically about his mother. And he talked about his mom, and he talked about his brother. But it was as if he didn't know a whole lot beyond that. So we were starting to realize we were probably discovering things he didn't know in life. My sister chased down his service and discovered that he was also in the Navy, served during the Civil War, served on 3 separate ships during the Civil War, one of which was a Confederate ship that had been acquisitioned by the Union and repurposed. He served on. And we found documents of him applying for his pension, and then once he passed, we found documents of his wife applying for his pension. So same thing, we now wanted to see, okay, where is he buried? We gotta find this. And we found documentation that he was buried in Laurel Cemetery. So we're going to Laurel Cemetery. Unbeknownst to us, that Laurel Cemetery doesn't exist anymore. That was a cemetery that was used in the early 1800s by rich white Americans. They would bury their servants there. And then in 1858, it officially turned into a cemetery for Black Americans. And so the Black Americans of Baltimore would then bury their loved ones there. There are some 230 Civil War vets, African Americans, that were buried at Laurel Cemetery. It got into financial trouble. It was sold off in 1957 or 58. And they told the families, we're going to move all the bodies to this town 200 miles away. And the families are like, well, how are you going to do that? We can't get 200 miles away to see our families, but that's what they told them. And then they paved over Laurel Cemetery, built a shopping center. but they actually never moved any bodies. So they've done scans of the lot. Over the years, there were these storms, and all of a sudden there'd be like bones sticking up from the ground, right? And so a few universities have actually scanned that location, and they estimate there's somewhere between 10 and 15,000 buried individuals underneath that lot. And so that's where he is. The picture on the left is the demolition occurring in 1957, and on the right, that's me and my sister in 2021. We traveled there, not unbeknownst to us, and so we just took a picture within the lot. So there's still work being done there. We're looking to get a stone placed at Loudon Cemetery in Baltimore, which is a national cemetery for the military. Even though we have no idea where he was buried, at least he will be recognized, and we can have some information on the stone for his service. But it's at our own cost, so we're still, getting the funds for that. So then the next path was to my mother's mother. I was a little, at this point, I was a little disheartened, because the first three of my four grandparents all ended in some cemetery in the woods or paved over, right? But we haven't quite gotten that far with my mother's mother yet. I also knew her well. She died in 2008. All my life she had an accent. I could never place the accent. I didn't even really recognize it. It was just normal to me. She would cook these foods that I thought were strange, but no one else cooked that stuff. She'd make these rum cakes for Christmas, and I would take it, and then I'd just put it in the corner. Like it was so alcoholic. There was so much rum in this cake. But I loved her to death. But I never knew where she was from. But during this research, my sister discovered all of her ancestors, her parents, her grandparents, and they were all located in Portland Township, Jamaica, or in Yallis, Jamaica. So that's where they all were. Then I went, oh, she was Jamaican. I'm like 40 years old at the time or something. Grandma was Jamaican. So I never knew that. But, and then we found an ID card where she was signed in. An application was given by my grandfather for her to be able to get on the Coco Solo base in the Canal Zone in Panama. So my grandfather was stationed there, right, in the 40s and 50s, and so she needed to get on, and so she had this ID card, and clearly on the ID it says citizenship Jamaican. Well, yeah, she's Jamaican. And so that was fascinating. That was the learning. We haven't gone much further back in her lineage yet, but we're still working that. But what I processed from that is, from a transatlantic slave trade perspective, like I got all these ties to all this stuff, right? So like, I went and me and my sister did the DNA test, right? And we discovered that like 84% of my lineage is from like that slave coast of Africa. And then the other 16% is relative to like these European countries, like Ireland and Norway, which kind of aligns to what we were seeing, in the research that she was looking at. So again, my grandmother's from the Caribbean, the West Indies. I got European DNA, and a large portion of it is from the African slave coast. It's like I was like, the epitome of that whole transatlantic triangle, which was shocking to me and enlightening. It actually made me think I'm much more ingrained into the establishment and soil of this country than I ever realized, right? Not only because of the lineage, but also because of the events. The 1918 flu pandemic, the great migration of African Americans from the South, West, and North between the 20s and 70s, that's what both of my grandparents did. Like I was just like entrenched in American history. That's what I learned, which changed my perspective. I talked to those things that I just kind of spoke to with regards to what I learned. You know, my ties to the West Indies, ties to the slave coast, ties to Europe, ties to the Civil War, both sides, right? Like Confederate and Union, like slavery and slaveholders, the flu pandemic, the Great Migration, and I also realized that documentation was so difficult. Not only because it just didn't exist in some scenarios, but things were a little more confusing because these slaves took on surnames of their owner, and that kind of created a cutoff. Like who were they before that? Well, we don't know, because once we get to a certain point, now we're tracking their owner instead of them. Confusion with the surnames. I didn't know about slaves being acquired just for sexual purposes. That was all news to me. I didn't know anything about how prevalent it was for them to be segregated in life and death. Like I didn't realize they're dead and now they're still segregated. I didn't know that. I was learning about how prevalent it was for lack of markers, lost cemeteries, and none of this was I ever really taught about. And so it was so profound to me. It gave me such a level of pride, and it completely wiped away that ideal that something relative to my skin color made me any less than anyone else. It was like it completely debunked that unconscious bias that I had. And it made me recognize that others may have that as well. And maybe these stories will do the same for them. Like, I don't know. So maybe what I should be doing is telling these stories. So that's where the work that I do now came into play. And this kind of talks to basically what I just said. I started to look at things like, standard things that we know, like wealth disparities and incarceration rates and health disparities, and I could kind of see ties based on my own research. And it also started to explain things to me. It explained things to me about who my relatives were that I knew. Like, I knew my grandfather, my father's father. I knew his demeanor, and I knew what you could and couldn't get away with. But I didn't understand him until I saw all this. And I also learned during this time that we eventually, in finding his family in Texas, he had 6 brothers and sisters. And we learned that the reason he left Texas during the Great Migration is because he was in the midst of an interracial marriage, and there was threats on him. So in the late 30s, he had to get out of Dodge, and that's how he ended up in San Diego. And so that impressed something on my mind as well, explained who he was, explained how he acted in life, which again also kind of aligns to why I started to think maybe these stories would help others come to a different place with regards to whatever unconscious bias they may have. So that takes me into this story that we're ultimately here for. I'm surprised Erica hasn't I'm really shocked she hasn't said anything. But that takes me into this story. So when I learned all this, I start telling these stories. It's probably 2017, 18. I start telling these stories all the time. And I was doing that for a while, thinking I was going to impress upon folks something that may open their eyes to some unconsciousness of bias. And then the pandemic hit in 2020. I couldn't really go anywhere to go get these stories. Before, I traveled to places where I had family, and then there would be a story there I could tell. But now I couldn't travel, so I was like, man, I got to go find stories in Connecticut now. But I don't know, you all may not have been like this, but I was like, how many how many stories around slavery am I going to find in Connecticut? Right, that was my thought at the time, right? And so that I could kind of align those to my path. Turns out I was just, every other day I was like finding another story. And so I was constantly like posting these stories, and I came across one that really stuck with me, like hit me in the chest. And I found a book by a gentleman by the name of Richard Phelps, and it was a book about Newgate Prison. And it was just a listing of various stories about Newgate Prison in East Granby, but it had a couple small paragraphs in that book about an individual by the name of Prince Mortimer. And the things that struck me about the story were, one, it said he lived to be 110 years old. It said he was brought to this country as a child. He was captured in Guinea. It said that he was sold to the Mortimer family in Middletown. But most importantly, it said he was a servant to different officers in the Revolutionary War and had been sent on errands by George Washington. And so I was fascinated by that. The story started with, he died at the prison in Wethersfield, right? So I'm like, there must be like, this sounds like a feature film. There must be like 20, there gotta be like 20 books about this guy, right? I learned no, that was pretty much the extent of it. I couldn't find anything else other than I found another book by a gentleman by the name of Dennis Caron, and he wrote the book in 2006, or published in 2006, and he basically had the same kind of reaction to this small blurb in the book from 1844 by Richard Phelps, which took him on a path to write his book. He says something at the beginning of his book, and I'll read that passage. He says, Prince's story does not derive its meaning from a series of defining events. Quite to the contrary, its meaning lies in their absence. And that resonated with me. Like we're trying to do the genealogy research, and we keep getting stuck, and there's a lack of documentation. So then we start trying to use cemeteries, and when we go to the cemeteries, there's lack of documentation. And Dennis Caron is, for me, he captured the essence of how I felt in that one sentence. So I bought his book, I start reading through it, and I learned some fascinating stuff. So his owner was an individual by the name of Philip Mortimer, who was from Ireland. He comes to this country early 1740s, and he comes into Boston. He marries a woman by the name of Martha in 1742, and by 1749 he's living in Middletown. So I don't know when he went from Boston to Middletown, but at some point between 1742 and 1749, he moves to Middletown to start a rope making business. And he thought it would be a great opportunity because Middletown was a big slave, a big ship creating town. They built ships, and they had to acquire their ropes from either New York or New Haven. So he thought if he set up a shop there to produce rope, he'd make a killing, right? So he sets his shop up on Main Street in Middletown. He needs slaves to work the shop. And at some point, he purchases Prince. And it's not only Prince that he purchases, he purchases many slaves. He trains Prince in the business. Prince becomes a very valuable spinner in the business. And at some point in that span, we know eventually, 20 years later, the Revolutionary War. You hear what Richard Phelps said, that Prince was sent off to the Revolutionary War. He obviously comes back because he's still enslaved. He wasn't freed after that. He's still listed as a slave of Philip Mortimer's post the Revolution. In 1792, Philip Mortimer writes a will. Now, by 1792, Philip Mortimer's wife had passed. He had no children. He only had a niece. So he states in his will that he's adopted his niece. And so he's leaving things to his niece and his niece's children. His niece was married to a gentleman by the name of George Starr. It's clear in his will he didn't quite like George Starr for whatever reason. I don't know why. But he wills property to his niece, her name is Anne, with a contingency that it must go to their children once her and George pass. And where that complicates this is that at that time, if something goes to the wife, then it essentially is the husband's. But because there's that little piece in the will, the husband can't really sell it off. He can't, because it's got to go to their kids. So George Starr really had no control based on this will Philip Mortimer wrote. Some other things interesting about the will is there were two individuals in the will named Jack and Sophie. They were slaves as well. They were married. It leaves them and their children property, furnishings, lots of stuff. Like they clearly had his heart in some way. So he leaves Jack and Sophie a lot of stuff. Prince is in that will as well, but Prince is listed as he is not to be freed until 3 years after my death. It's as if he thought if he freed Prince, then his business would go downhill, because Prince is such a capable spinner. So Prince was supposed to remain enslaved. By 1793, Philip Mortimer adds an addendum to that will, which basically just gives those two other slaves, Jack and Sophie, more stuff. Now it gives them like this lake house and chapel and like more things. So again, clearly he had an affinity for Jack and Sophie. By 1794, he rewrites the whole will. But this time, he pretty much rewrote it verbatim. Nothing changed, except for two lines. But the most important line is, instead of saying Prince was to be freed 3 years after his death, now it just said Prince is to be freed on my death. So he had a second thought for whatever reason. And so now he's like, I'll go ahead and free Prince. And I'll show you that document. But before I do that, this is like a map of Main Street, Middletown. And it's like a street I driven down many a time. And this is in Dennis Caron's book. And it's like, what? Like, it shows you that road from Hartford into Middletown. I've driven that. I know where they're at. And it shows you where Philip Mortimer lived up in the upper right. I'm like, this is crazy. And then it's showing like Philip Mortimer's rope walk. I'm like, that's a restaurant there now. Like I could like places based on what was in the map in this book. Where and then I also noticed that Captain Gleason's slave dealer was like right next door to his rope walk. So I'm like, oh, he probably was just purchasing Prince and the others right next door. And so back to the will. In the will, please don't try to read this. It took me like forever to even, you got to get your eyes ready to start reading the documentation from that time. But basically, the first one is like, I give to my Negro Prince 3 years after my decease his freedom, right? And then the bottom is the second will, where he says, I give unto my Negro Prince his freedom. That's what he changed in the documentation. So Philip dies. Within 2 days of writing the second will, Philip dies. And I'm sure the slaves in that household were like, we're about to be free, I'm about to get all this stuff, you know. But the son-in-law was not too happy, so he contests the will. And without going into too much detail, other than he was able to find issues with witnesses to these wills, he won. And so everything had to go into probate and eventually just went to Anne and George. So Prince was not free. So Prince stays a slave from 1794 all the way until 1811. So now, in 1811, you know, he's an old man now. Supposedly, by that time, he would have been 87 years old. If you go with the dates and the age represented in the 2 prior books. But he's working in the house for George. He's serving him his breakfast. One morning, George recognizes something odd in his morning chocolate. He accuses Prince of that being arsenic. I'm not sure whether or not they were able to prove whether or not that was arsenic or not. But he went to the authorities, and Prince was convicted and sentenced to life to Newgate Prison in 1811. So I was fascinated by all of this stuff that was in Dennis Carey's book. I wanted to see some of these documents he's talking about. So I go to the Connecticut State Library, and I find out that at the Connecticut State Library, you don't just walk in and go, yeah, I just want to see that, I need to see that will. But, you know, you have to have much more information. But and once you give them the information, it's like stuck in the basement, and there's a whole process, and like 3 hours later or 4 hours later, or sometimes the next day, you can come back, and they'll let you in a separate location where you're going to look at this stuff. So I learned that. And so I request information on these court jackets, you know, of Prince being convicted. And so I had to come back after I filled out the paperwork. I didn't even have a card. You didn't have to have a card for the Connecticut State Library. You didn't fill out for the card. And so I come back, and they give me this box in this secured area. And I'm scared to death to touch this box. It's like everything in there looks like if I touch it, it could tear. And if I tear anything, like is some bell or whistle going to go off? Like I was freaking out. And so I asked the person in the section, like, can I get some gloves? So I'm thinking, right, that's what I've seen on TV. Don't they put on gloves? And the person was like, you don't really need gloves. And I was like, all right. I learned later in talking to others that do this type of research, so I guess that in the past, that was common, that they wanted you to use gloves. But then they learned that the harshness of the glove created more damage to the documentation than just the oils on your hand. So now they're like, no gloves. Like, I didn't know that. But they were like, no, John, no gloves. I'm sure they knew I was new there. So I started going through this thing, and I'm all slow and being all careful. And sure enough, I find that court jacket where Prince was convicted and sent to prison. And this is just the front of the jacket, right? Within the jacket, it spells out the whole case the state had against him. And you know, it's a lot of detail in it, but the front of the jacket just, you know, state versus Prince Negro, which was also new. I'd called him Prince Mortimer to this day, but they called him Prince Negro. I learned that if you were a slave, like they weren't going to let you use the surname. You know, you're going to be listed like this. So that's why he was listed that way. But it said on the docket that he was found guilty, and he was sent to Newgate for life, and that was on December 21st of 1811. And I was like, wow, this is nuts. And the information in it was crazy, how they were accusing him and how the case went. But what I also found in that same document, in that same jacket, was a whole nother court filing. The state against Jack Mortimer. So, but it doesn't have any verdict, right? So as if they were about to, file a case against Jack, but same date, December 1811, But they decided not to prosecute. So I open that up, I read that, and within that one, it said, same story as it says in Prince's, except it puts Jack as the instigator. It's like Jack with malicious intent, he goes and inquires arsenic, to put, and he convinces Prince to put this arsenic in this morning chocolate, you know, and he was the, you know, they really kind of pointed the finger at him, Prince just being like, you know, elderly man that agreed to do something he probably shouldn't have done. But they never prosecuted, which made the idea of Jack being the instigator made sense to me, right? I was thinking this will, I mean, Jack and Sophie and his kids were about to get all this property and all this stuff, and George Starr comes along and they don't get anything. That makes sense. He probably convinced Prince to put something in his chocolate. But also, looking at all of this, I also was thinking, a part of my mind was, what would I do? What would anyone do? You were taken from your country, ripped from the arms of your mother and your father, put on a ship, brought to a whole nother land, enslaved all your life, fought for the country, or at least with a player or participant in a revolution, potentially promised freedom at that point, rescinded, stayed enslaved for another, 30 years beyond that, or 20 years beyond that, promised freedom again in a will, rescinded, and then another 16 years passed, and you're about to be 90. Like, I was struggling even to put blame on Prince in my mind. I couldn't process that an 87-year-old man is being sent to prison after the country, to me, committed the crime, right? So that was a part of my processing. So Prince is at Newgate, 1811. I find another court docket from 1822. Now by 1822, those two participants that, the daughter and son-in-law that contested the will, they're dead. And the niece or daughter died in 1817. George Starr dies in 1821. So now all this property and money and all goes to their child, specifically to their daughter, Martha. This 1822 docket is a year after George's death. Now, 1822, Prince is at Newgate still. Jack Mortimer is accused of burning down one of the properties that Martha owned, that was willed to her, deeded to her. And that made sense to me as well. I was like, okay, he was probably the instigator in the arsenic thing, right, 11 years ago, and now he burns down one of those properties because he's still upset, right? And so he's sentenced to Newgate as well at that point for 5 years. So now Prince and Jack are both at Newgate prison together. Like I would love to know what their conversation was like, knowing that all these people and all this money and all this stuff is over there, and they worked for this family all their lives, and now they're sitting at what at the time was considered to be the worst prison in the country, right? So I did some more digging trying to find Jack at the prison, because at the time there were questions about whether or not Newgate should remain as a state prison, and they were doing reviews of the prison at the time. They did one in 1825, and the state had a document that listed who was there in 1825 as a part of that review of Newgate. And Jack isn't on that document, but he should have been, because he was supposed to be there from 1822 to 1827, 5 years. But in 1825, Jack ain't there. The only person that's there is Prince. Prince is clearly there, but Jack isn't. I assume he died at Newgate. I don't know that. There's no other documentation about what happened to Jack. I know Sophie died in 1807, his wife, but I have no idea what happened to Jack after he went to Newgate. He disappears after that conviction. So again, I assume he died at Newgate Prison. So I was a little upset about all of this. Jack going to prison, dying there, and being buried somewhere in Newgate. I knew Prince was then transferred to Wethersfield in 1828 when they shut down Newgate. I knew that he was now at the Wethersfield prison, and I assumed they had a cemetery. And I looked that up and I learned online, yeah, they did. They had a cemetery. And I find some picture of some person, current day, like 10 or 20 years ago, who went there and took a picture next to some stones that were like popping out of the ground where the cemetery was at Wethersfield. And so I was like, I couldn't find that. So I always drag my wife around with me on these weird expeditions. But I'm like, we gotta go see it, right, Erica? And she's like, oh yeah. And so we get to Cove Park. We parked on the wrong side of Cove Park. And we ended up walking the trail, trying to find, we had no idea where it was at, so we're just looking everywhere, walking the trail around Cove Park. And we end up on the west end, right behind the yacht club, and we see this marker. And I see the stones in the grass that I saw online, the outline of the cemetery. And I start reading what's on the marker. The marker says the first cemetery operated from 1828 to 1888 was located nearby, but all traces of it have since been erased. So it basically was telling me that, yeah, this was the cemetery for Wethersfield Prison, but this was the second cemetery. The first one, they don't know where it's at. And I'm going, well, Prince died in 1834, so he's not here. So I still didn't know where Prince was. Where's Prince? So I continue reading this. It mentions Prince on the plaque. This is just a small portion of the plaque that I have here. It's a large plaque with lots of information about the prison. But in this section of that plaque, it mentions Prince. And it mentions him as a past slave that lived to be 110 that's buried there. And that bugged me a little bit. Considering his lifespan, I thought this demeans him down to a slave and a criminal. And that life he lived, and the fact that he was a participant in the revolution, I felt like that story should be told as well. That should be somewhere here, not just that he was a criminal. And so, I now wanted to go see, well, where are the participants that own these folks? Where are they at? Where's George Starr and Anne and Martha and Philip Mortimer? And where are they at? And I learned that there's a cemetery in Middletown, Mortimer Cemetery. He donated the land. And so, and I also contacted Dennis Caron, the writer of the first book, and I'm talking to him about it. I'm like, this is bugging me, I don't know. And he's like, John, have you gone to check out the cemetery yet? I'm like, I went over there. There's a lock on the gate in Middletown. I can't get in that thing. And he's like, no, you can. He's like, just go down to the firehouse right down the street. They have the key. Ask them for the key. You can walk over there, walk right in. I'm like, what? Okay, so I drag Erica with me again to Middletown. We're going to Middletown. They got a key. So we get to the firehouse. Sure enough, guy comes out. I tell him I want to see more of the cemetery. He gives me a key. We walk a block. We walk in the cemetery, and I find, sure enough, the tomb of Philip Mortimer, and that's in the middle. And the tomb isn't just a tomb of Philip Mortimer, it's a tomb of him, his wife, and all his friends. So like he allowed them to be kind of buried in the same tomb. So there's like stones around it that mention like who they are, right? And right next to it is this headstone for George Starr and his wife Anne, and their daughter Martha, and like it just was such a stark contrast, right? I can't find anything on these people, just like I couldn't find anybody relative to my lineage. But if I go back and look for Philip, I mean, I find an abundance of information relative to everything about his family, right on the stones, right? That contrast stuck in my mind. But also, one of his friends was this guy named John Easton, who was buried in the same tomb. That's the picture on the right. And I had heard that name before. I didn't know where, but it eventually came to me. I had heard that name in a book written by Anne Farrow. Anne Farrow had written a book called The Log Books, and it was about the slave trade and its relationship to New England. And in her book, she writes about John Easton. She talks about how he owned like a farm in Middletown. And she talks about how John Easton, it was said that if you weren't talking about slave trading, he didn't want to talk to you. That's what he did. And he was all about that. He had no emotion about it. He would sail to the west coast of Africa. He would trap slaves. He would then sail over to the West Indies, and he would sell the slaves. Then he would sail back to Middletown, and he would get crops and cattle from his farm, and then he would take those, he would sail back to the West Indies, and then he would sell all that stuff to the slaveholders there so that they can feed the slaves. So like he was just making money like twice, right? So again, for me, it just tied into who these people were. This last sentence was really clear. It was like, in talking about John Easton, it was like, he could not allow fellow feeling or pity or curiosity or tenderness. He was just hard and fast slave trafficker. And that's what he was. But being that he was such a good friend of Philip, it kind of, I took note to that as well. So now we wanted to, I say we because I'm dragging Eric along. But I wanted to figure out how to create some type of memorial in the locations, same as I was doing with my own family. We're looking at creating a stone whenever we find my grandparents in East Texas to place there with documentation for whomever comes behind us so they can learn more about them. Same with my third great-grandfather in Baltimore, who's buried under that parking lot. We're looking at trying to create a stone with more information so whoever comes behind me will learn more about them. I thought we need to do the same thing with regards to Jack and Prince. So I created a post and plugged it in certain corners of social media, telling the story of Prince, and then looking for signatures to a petition that I could then use to convince those powers that be that we should be creating some type of memorial and the reasoning. And I ran into great supporters of that idea in this town. The Veterans Commission invited me to their one of their meetings, and I spoke about what I was looking to do. The Wethersfield Historical Society engaged with me immediately once they saw this post, and we started a long dialogue that's been going on for over a year. I met with Jesse Nasta, Dr. Jesse Nasta at Webb-Deane University, and he's the director at the Middlesex County Historical Society. He hits me up and he's like, I keep seeing you on Facebook posting pictures in my town, but you haven't been at the Historical Society in Middletown. I'm like, oh, I'm coming. So I went and met with him. I had one challenge, and I met with the Connecticut Daughters of the Revolution, and they were like, John, this is cool. if you're looking to get that marker to state Prince's alignment to the revolution, I'm going to need you to do something for me. I'm going to need you to go find a living descendant of Prince, and I'm going to need you to go find definitive documentation that he was in the revolution. Simply having the words of Richard Phelps isn't enough. And so if you could go work on that, then we can start a dialogue on how to get it recognized through the Daughters of the Revolution. And I was like, wow, okay. But I read Dennis Caron's book, and he said Prince had no kids. And so how would I get a living descendant? And if there was broader documentation for him being at the revolution, then wouldn't Dennis have written that? And then I started thinking about the fact of my family's lack of documentation, his lack of documentation. That was the order of the day back then. So I don't know how to align to that precedent. Like, you're saying that we're not going to document this, but today you're telling me I have to have that document. Like, there was just a contradiction in my mind. Like, I didn't know how to do that. I wasn't even sure if it was a fair question. But I decided I was going to figure it out. Okay, let's go find it. And so I go to Valley Forge, musterroll.org. And at the time, I'd been looking on Ancestry.com and on Fold3 and on all these various sites where you can look up information on military vets. But I wasn't finding a whole lot. But at valleyforgemusterrolls.org, I was able to find someone listed from Connecticut named Prince Negro. I found two. Actually, I'm sorry, I found three. I found three individuals named Prince Negro from Connecticut. So then I started looking at the three, and one died in 1775, and I was like, okay, African American, but that ain't him, because Prince wasn't dead in 1775. The second, it listed as an American Indian. Like, well, that ain't Prince. I mean, if you read Richard Phelps' book, it said he was the personification of darkness, meaning the slaves from Guinea were very, very dark. And so I'm like, they couldn't have mistaken him as an American Indian. That ain't him. So then I ended with, there's only one left. There's a Prince Negro from the 5th Regiment of Connecticut. And he was at Valley Forge with George Washington, which aligned with what Richard Phelps said in his book. So I thought I had hit it. I'm like, here it is right now. I'm about to take this back. I'm about to do this. Right? And, but I go back to the DAR, and the DAR's like, well, that's common name Prince. And they always called them, the last name Negro when they were slaves. But there could have been 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, there could have been any number of Prince Negroes from Connecticut that were a part of the revolution. It doesn't necessarily mean that one is the one you're looking for. We're going to need you to see if you can find a tie between that particular person you found from Connecticut and Philip Mortimer. They wanted me to tie him to the Mortimer name.
Wow.
Which I've never been able to do. I'm still working on that. I haven't been able to do that yet. These are like some of the muster rolls of that particular individual. What's interesting about them is the first one, Washington and his troops, they're staying over the winter at Valley Forge, and then in June of 1778, they're then marching towards Monmouth. They're leaving Valley Forge. And what I found interesting about this is halfway between Valley Forge and Monmouth, they tell Prince Negro, they leave him on the side of the road. He was sick. So the first, this is just one of the muster rolls. You can clearly see they left him at the side of the road, but he was too sick to continue on. And then another muster roll a month later, you see Prince Negro, it says in the muster roll, he's sick in Englishtown. So, he was having, whoever this is, that he was having some ailments. He didn't quite continue on with George Washington's march post Valley Forge. And then he is, he's out of the Revolution a few months later. So, if this is him, it's fascinating information. The muster rolls are fascinating bits of information. But again, I was unable to use it because, again, the Daughters of the Revolution want me to kind of tie him to Philip Mortimer. I then switched tracks, and now I was just trying to look at, did he have kids? And I had believed what Dennis Karen said, that no, he didn't have kids. Dennis Karen's thought was that he couldn't have had kids because in the probate documentation for the will, it lists Prince as having zero value, worth $0, and next to him it says sick with yaws. And back then, now yaws is the bacterial infection. Take some penicillin, 5 days later you're fine. But back then there was no penicillin, so what would happen is it would eat away your skin, you prick boils, then they would harden, you'd have these nodules all over your body, and most people, it would eat away at their nose, and then they would have this hole in the middle of their face. It was just incredibly disfiguring infection. And so Dennis Moore, in his book, Dennis Karen kind of assumes that he caught yaws on the slave ship. He's making this assumption. He caught him in Africa, and he had it all his life, and he takes that assumption to, and that's why he never married and had no kids, because he was probably scary to look at, right? So that's his kind of dialogue relative to it. So I was like, I'm never gonna find this guy. He never had any kids. Dennis is saying he was too scary. But I did find kids. I started looking at the church records of the town of Middletown, and I found a record from 1803 that said, at the time, Anne, the Mortimer Starr, who was the daughter of Philip Mortimer, was taking slaves to the church and baptizing them. And it shows that she took John, Samuel, and Zilpah to be baptized in 1803, and it says right there, they're the children of Prince. And so I was fascinated by that. I thought, oh my goodness, where are these kids at? Right above it, it says that she had taken Charles, Negro child of Jack and Sophie. Now, remember, Jack and Sophie were the individuals that were getting all that land in Philip Mortimer's will. So I found that fascinating, that she took some of Jack's kids there to be baptized. So now I was on the hunt for a John, Samuel, or Zilpah, so that I can try to figure out how to draw this line to a living descendant today. And I was just lost. I couldn't find anything. I talked to Jesse Nosta at Wesleyan, and he said, I think my students might be able to help you. Can you come in and talk, and we can see if they can help work on this for you. So I went in, and I gave a lecture, and at the time they were studying Dennis Karen's book, and that was going to be their work. They were going to try to help me kind of find some of this stuff. But he also said, can you stop by the Historical Society, because I think I have some information that also might help you. So I went by the Historical Society, and he presented me with some information that I had never seen. It was a document produced by the granddaughter of Philip Mortimer, who now owned all this property, the one who sent Jack to prison for burning down one of the homes. It was her, in 1828, Jack's now dead, Sophie's now dead, Prince is in Wethersfield. She's willing that same land that was in the original will from 1794, she's deeding that same property to all the kids of Jack and Sophie. So, and what struck me, I was like, well, why is she doing that? Did something happen? Was there some guilt? Did she just learn about Philip Mortimer's will? Like, why all of a sudden at that point? She had just been a part of sending Jack to prison in 1822. Why now, in 1828, she's willing his kids this land? Right? It threw me. 2 years later, in 1830, and that's what you're seeing on the screen, there's a document showing Charles coming from New York back to Middletown to sell the property that was deeded to him. But he comes back with his wife, Zilpah. Last time I heard that name, Zilpah, that was Prince's daughter. And Charles is Jack's son. And so I'm like, wait a minute. They got married. And they moved to New York. That's why I can't find them, right? And so Jesse's showing me this information. So then I start digging into that. Where is Charles and Zilpah? Because if I can find them, if they had any kids, then I'm getting to the descendants of Prince. Also, what was also fascinating about that information that Jesse got me is that at the time, there was a new church in New York. It was Shiloh Presbyterian Church. It was a colored Presbyterian church, very famous. It was the first one of its kind there. They also had a pastor named Samuel Cornish that had written, or was a part of publishing, the very first African-American newspaper in the country. So, and I found this line in the Christ Church records in Middletown that said that Charles was dismissed and recommended on December 4th, 1828 to the Colored Presbyterian Church in New York. So the church in Middletown, I guess he was moving, told him this is where you should go. So my next stop was to go find out if the church records for Shiloh Presbyterian Church, since it was such a famous church, it's famous people. It was an abolitionist type church. They were part of the Underground Railroad. They spoke out loudly about slavery. It was like, so I started down that track, still got stuck. I'm still struggling to find what happened to Charles and Zilpah once they got to New York. He then told me also, so I'm still working that track, he then told me about the mayor of Hartford from 1981 to 1987. Jesse Nosta says, he's related to Jack, and he wrote a book. I'm like, what? This story is crazy. Okay, he's like, you should go read that book. Maybe that book will tell you where Charles and Zilpah are. You could have told me that last month. So I buy the book, and I'm reading the book, and what I learned is Mayor Milner, who I invited here tonight, but he's 88. I'm sure that'd be tough for him to come. But what I find out is he didn't know what happened to Jack. In his book, he traces his lineage back to himself being a descendant of Jack and Sophie. But in his book, that's as far as he got. He doesn't know who Jack's parents are. He doesn't know who Sophie's parents are. He doesn't know what happened to Jack after Philip Mortimer's will. He doesn't know that Jack went to prison in 1822. He didn't know about Charles and Zilpah. Like in his book, he stops at Jack was a slave of Philip Mortimer. So that's as far as he knew. So now I was interested in kind of getting him this additional information, but it didn't take me any further on my journey. But it was fascinating that I'm finding these ties. Also, what it made me realize is that in looking at birth records of the time, that Philip Mortimer could have done work to resolve this. Like, this didn't have to be like this. At the time, the church records would document baptisms, and if you had slaves, the documentation of a slave being baptized didn't list their parents. It just listed who owned them. And the Connecticut State Library has indexed that information and presented it. And in that information, I can find the slaves that were born in Philip Mortimer's house. I could find them. One person I find in that house is Sophie, right? She was born into slavery in Philip Mortimer's house on August 11, 1752. Which means Philip Mortimer knew who her parents were, because her parents were slaves he owned, right? But we're all lost today. We don't know who her parents were because that was never documented. The only thing that's documented is that Philip Mortimer was the slaveholder. And that was striking to me, and left an impression on me, right? That it was the practice. It wasn't accidental that this information doesn't exist. It wasn't accidental that I can't find it. It was the practice. At that point, I kind of set aside the work relative to kind of getting alignment with the Daughters of the Revolution and started just working with what the Wethersfield Historical Society had said that they would do for me. They were very willing to like create this marker and update the existing marker, and they were very willing to put something there to tell more about the story. And so I thought, well, okay, then that's what we're going to do. Let's just do it. And they said, well, John, cost about $3K. And I was like, oh, okay. I don't think America will let me write a check for $3K, but let me see if I can raise that money. So I had been telling this story now for over a year online. So when I went back online and said, okay, we can get markers, but it's going to cost us $3K. Let's do a fundraiser. Within 4 hours, I had the money. So I went back to I just talked to them. I called them back later that night. Okay, we got the money. What are we doing the marker? We're doing the marker, right? And they were like, yeah, John, we got it. Let's do it. They said, but we think you should talk to another individual first. His name is Frank Winarski, and he was born and raised in Wethersfield, right across the street from the prison. And he was a collector most of his life of information relative to Wethersfield Prison. And in the 90s, he became a researcher, and he's researched that prison. He knows a lot about the cemetery, about the prison itself. You should talk to him before we do this, because there might be other things you want on this marker. And I was like, okay. So a few weeks ago, during Heritage Weekend here in Wethersfield, they invited me to Kinney Hall, and I had a booth set up that, just to share information about Prince with the people of the town. And Frank comes in, and I sit down and talk with him, and he invites me to his home, and he starts showing me documentation that he has. And he shows me newspaper clippings of when he was at this very point I'm at, from back in the 90s and early 2000s, when he was fighting to get greater recognition of the folks that are buried at that cemetery at Cove Park, which was the old location of Wethersfield Prison. And his mission was, mine was very specific to an individual, and his was more broad. It was like, he wanted the list of the names that are buried at these cemeteries, because he said that documentation's been lost, but he's been able to uncover it by going through like 100 years worth of newspaper clippings. So when someone died at the prison, it would be in the newspaper, and he found them. Tedious work. Wow. Over decades, he had the list of individuals at the prison. I'm like, this is nuts, Frank. Like, okay, are we putting them on there then too? Let's go ahead. And then he says, and there's one individual there, his name is Nicholas Monroe. He was a Civil War vet. I really want him there. I dig into research about Nicholas Monroe, and he was an African American man from Maryland, like my third great grandfather, and he was a part of the 31st Colored Regiment, which is a famous regiment. And after the Civil War, he was convicted of burglary, and he was sent to Wethersfield Prison, and he was buried in the first cemetery there as well. And so I found all this information out there. We were able to do his genealogy, and we found his family. They're all living in Colorado now. I contacted them, and they were excited about the information, and they want to know more about, is there really going to be a memorial at Wethersfield Cove? And I told them yes. So if and when that ever happens, they're very interested in the entire story. But Frank told me some other things that was fascinating to me. He was like, John, you know, there's a picture of the Cove from 1901 that shows the first cemetery when the wall was there, when there wasn't just stone in the grass. And I was like, nah, I never seen anything like that. I saw that by now, but I got it at home. And so he sent me that picture. I put this together, this is current day, with that red star at the bottom of the marker, so that it'll just give you a context of where that marker is in these subsequent pictures. And I also want to just show you what that stone in the ground looks like today. You can kind of see it peeking through the grass, right? On the east end of this rectangular block that was the second cemetery. And on the west end of it, you can see like kind of white material on the top of that base of that wall. He then shows me this picture from 1901. It's starred representing where I'm standing in current day, where the marker is. And you can see there's a white wall right there, right? Like, there's the wall, John. And he's like, on the left side of that wall, that's the second cemetery. The right side is the first cemetery. All that happened was, on the right side, that area of Cove Park tends to be very soft. And for that reason, they would bury inmates there, and the bodies would end up, they didn't bury them that deep, they'd end up coming back up. And so you'd see bones out of the ground. So they created a wall, and they created a second cemetery on the other side of that wall. So he says, so you were standing right there where Prince was, you just had to turn, you know, instead of over here. You were standing right there. And I was like, oh, wow, okay. And he then showed me something I'd also never seen. He showed me a site survey that was done of that land in 2000. The U.S. Department of Agriculture came here and they worked with the Connecticut State Historical Society, and they did a scan. They knew that over that wall to the right was the first cemetery and to the left was the second. So they just scanned right in front of the first cemetery, and as you can see, they found all kinds of anomalies to the right of that star. So literally where I was standing were graves, right? Like, so right to the right of that star. So he said that's where Prince is. He's right there. And so if we create a marker, we can now, in current day, represent the first and second cemetery, and we can represent who's in them. So that has now, our efforts have combined to not simply be about Prince, but about all the individuals that are buried there. He also showed me another document that I was fascinated by. He was like, John, you know, they used to do statements each year for the prisons. How many inmates came in? How many were discharged? How many died? And he said, I have the one for the rolling year from April 1st, 1833 through March 31st, 1834. And he said, we know Prince Mortimer died on March 11th, 1834. And when you look at that report, it says only one person died during that period. So that must be Prince. And then he showed me the most fascinating thing I had seen to date. He said, and at that time when someone dies, the doctors came from Hartford and they did like a survey and autopsy, if you will, to make sure that there wasn't any type of, you know, criminal act that caused their death, so they could just define how they died. And he had the document for Prince. And as you can see, it said, the convicts have generally been very healthy during the last year. There's been only one death for about 20 months, ending on March 31st. The subject was a very aged colored man, a native of Africa, and who had no bodily disease at the time of his death, sufficient to produce such a result. An examination of his body was had after his death in the presence of Dr. Brigham and Berry of Hartford, which fully confirmed the truth of the above statement. It was abundantly evident that he died of old age. He was supposed, from all that could be gathered relative to his age, to have seen between 110 and 120. And to that point, if I'm being honest with you, I was questioning the whole 110 thing. I was like, I think when Philip Mortimer got here in around 1749, he bought Prince from that slave dealer right across the street. And when he bought him, we know he was a young kid, so let's say he was 7. And so if he was 7 in 1749, that means he was born in 1742, which would make him like 12 years younger than they're saying. So I was like, he's mid-90s, he's not 110. Right, that had been my perspective. But now I had to second guess that. I mean, if 2 physicians were looking at him and their minds kind of went with that idea that he was, right? So now I'm questioning myself, right? But secondly, the only document that I ever saw that said Prince was sick with anything was that probate document. And it said he was worth 0 value and he had sick with yaws. And I know Dennis Carron's book kind of extrapolated on that about his visual appearance and the boils and all that. But when I looked at this, I thought, wouldn't they have mentioned that? Like, if they saw all of that? And so I also question he ever really had yaws now as well. The whole context of he just was just too scary to have kids. Like, I know he has kids. So that kind of dismissed that for me as well. In the interim, as I work with the Historical Society, and again, they're very willing. They're saying we should have a new marker up there sometime in the fall. They're hoping to get an unveiling of that marker at Cove Park. And so as I work with them, I'm really excited about it. I'll be putting out more information about that, and hopefully we can get an attendance there when they unveil this new marker that lists these individuals, specifically Prince, and a fuller breadth of his story. But in the interim, I decided on Memorial Day to go over to Cove Park and just place flowers there with a card holder, those little plastic card holders, rods that you can stick in a planter, and I put it in the ground where I believe the first cemetery was, and I put a handful of cards in that card holder that just told the story of Prince Mortimer, right? That for me was like the replacement of a full marker until we get a full marker. So I placed it there, and I came back a week or so later thinking, okay, the flowers are all withered now. Town's gonna be like, John's over here leaving dead flowers. So I'm like, let me go over here and get these flowers. And so go back to Wethersfield Cove. I'm going over there to get these flowers. The flag that I put a flag in the ground. The flag was gone. The card stem was gone. There were no cards, but the flowers were still there. They weren't withered, but they were still there. And I was like, okay, let me take these flowers and throw them in the trash. So I'm picking the flowers up when an older gentleman was walking the path, and he stops me. He's like, oh, did you read the card in those flowers? And I was like, what card? And so I started looking at the flower, and he's like, there was a card in there. And he starts to tell me the entire story of Prince Mortimer. And I just acted like, that is crazy. They brought him from Newgate? Are you serious? I just acted like I'd never heard that story ever before. And he was so excited to tell me and fascinated by the story he had read on that card. I felt like that was something telling me that there is supposed to be a marker there. And that's what everyone would do if they read this on a marker there. So again, if you have time, and in the future once we get this going, and can come out to a ceremony that we present there, I hope you will. My mission is to just acknowledge these people, acknowledge them in a way that they may not have been acknowledged in life, provide documentation of information that will help others that come in the future, to be able to learn about them, and or if they're related to them, be able to learn about their own family. And which is why Prince Mortimer's story ties so well and resonates so well with me in my mind. Thank you all for coming out here and listening to this story. Feel free to ask if you have any. I don't know that you have any, but if you do. Yes, absolutely.
The cemetery in Middletown, is that Riverside Cemetery?
No, it's called Mortimer Cemetery. Riverside is right across, is down the street. But Mortimer Cemetery is near the corner of where that slave dealer was. Near the corner of Washington and Main, a little further down the street. But and less than a block from their fire department on Main Street.
I don't know where that cemetery is.
Yeah, it's a fascinating place.
I know where Riverside is, but I don't know where it is.
Are you going to write a book?
I haven't had any intention of but I've had that question asked of me before, so maybe.
Now I'm going to have a hard time remembering.
Yes, yes.
John, is the Starr family the family that owned the Starr Mill that was a gun factory in Middletown?
I wonder the same thing. I believe so, but I haven't done that research to validate that.
I have a friend who lives and works in that building.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I wondered the same.
And she told me that the family basically made their money by selling guns to the Confederate Army during the Civil War.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, that's, I don't know what her evidence is for that.
Right.
But there must be some.
Right. Yeah, I wondered the same. Thank you for that. Yes.
So whatever happened to the university students' research?
Yeah, they were really fascinated with the information I provided them. At the time, they were studying Dennis Aaron's book, and I had gone much, I don't know how much further, but I had gone further than the book documented, and I may have been doing their homework for them in some way. I didn't know it because I would say things like, yeah, you know, Jack and Sophie's daughter Amaryllis, and this woman, the young lady in the class, like, Amaryllis was Jack and Sophie's daughter? I was like, oh yeah, I figured that out when I probably shouldn't tell you that. So I think that I was actually helping them a little more, and to date, they really haven't provided any additional information.
You have done immaculate genealogy.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I give a lot of that credit to my sister. She did a lot of that work, but it's been good. It's been very educational for me, very enlightening for me. Sure. Oh, Frank is here. Hey, Frank. He brought a picture of what Wethersfield prison looked like at the time.
Remember,
Yeah.
I went in there when they were tearing it down.
Yeah.
And I got one of the prisoners' stool, and I still have it.
Wow. Yeah. And it's fascinating to me,
It was really quite a place.
some of the information they have relative to that prison. It was fascinating to me, the information that Frank had. It was unbelievable, the work that he's done in finding those individuals that are there in that cemetery.
Wow.
So, yeah, some fascinating stuff.
Wow.
Thank you.